everybody, I'm Joe's Disney Guy and welcome to another Disney Guy review. Today we'll be looking at arguably Disney's most stylized and unique looking feature, Sleeping Beauty. By the 1950s, things were going pretty well at the Disney studio. After surviving the lean years of the 40s, Disney was back on top and as busy as ever thanks to the success of Cinderella, with multiple shows, live-action movies, and the construction of Disneyland occupying the studio. But of course, the bread and butter of Disney is their animated features, and Walt was looking for another new fairy tale to adapt to the big screen. Oddly enough, before this, Disney had only adapted two fairy tales into features in Snow White and Cinderella. Although just about every movie that they did was based off of pre-existing stories, things like Pinocchio and Peter Pan weren't actually fairy tales. I find this interesting because when I think of Disney, I think of fairy tales, yet only 3 of their first 17 films were actually based off of fairy tales. Walt decided on a tale written by French author Charles Perrault entitled The Sleeping Beauty, and on January 15, 1950, registered the title Sleeping Beauty for the project, and work on the film began in 1951, with a full storyboard completed in 1952. However, Walt wasn't happy with the original storyboard for Sleeping Beauty. The problem was that the story was too similar to other fairy tales that the studio had adapted, and Walt wanted for this endeavor to be bigger, better, and unique to anything else that Disney had done to date. The storyboard was thrown out and the story was reworked, this time using elements from another classic telling of the Sleeping Beauty legend, Briar Rose, written by the Brothers Grimm. Although elements from the Brothers Grimm version are far more prevalent in the Disney story than any elements from Perrault's version, the credit in the beginning of the movie says that it's based off the fairy tale by Charles Perrault. So, why is that? I have a bit of a theory, but we'll get to that later. This version of the storyboard met Walt's approval, and work on Sleeping Beauty as Disney's 17th full-length animated feature began. Walt was determined to make Sleeping Beauty the pinnacle of animation at the time, and wanted it to look and feel unlike anything else released by the Disney studio. In order to do this, he named Ivan Earl, a man who had only joined the studio in 1951, as the head of art direction for the film. Walt continually said that he wanted Sleeping Beauty to look like a moving illustration, and Earl made this possible by basing his backgrounds off of medieval and Gothic art. Earl was also given an incredible amount of leeway due to Walt not being able to be around the studio as much due to the multitude of projects going on for the company at the time. Earl ended up using this freedom to institute a uniform color style throughout the film, which actually took the colors of the individual characters out of the animator's hand for the first time at the studio. His sharper style of backgrounds was also a major departure from previous Disney films, and the typically more rounded Disney characters didn't fit in well with this new type of background. In order to compensate, just about all of the animators at Disney had to alter their style to better match Earl's. As you can imagine, Earl kind of rubbed some of the longtime animators at the studio the wrong way. For one, he was only at the studio for a few years, and yet was allowed to come in and basically tell the animators to change the style that had given Disney so much success over the years. Then, of course, Earl was a bit of a perfectionist as well, and for anyone who's been around somebody like that, they can tell you that it can get a little bit grating at times. But as much as I can understand where the old hands are coming from, you have to respect Earl for having such a clear vision, and he had Walt's blessing, so there really wasn't much room to complain. Although the character animators had some things taken out of their hands this time around, their roles were still vastly important in the making of the feature. Mark Davis handled the animation on both Aurora and Maleficent, basing Aurora off of famed actress Audrey Hepburn, and giving Maleficent her signature look, complete with a flame-like robe and horns. Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston were in charge of the 3 fairies, whose characterization changed greatly throughout development. Walt originally envisioned 3 to 7 identical fairies, but Thomas and Johnston objected, claiming that the idea would be too boring. Instead, they pitched the idea of 3 unique fairies, much in the vein of Huey, Dewey, and Louie, to be named Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, with powers based off of their names. Although the idea of specific powers was dropped, the concept of 3 unique fairies who could play off of each other stayed. In order to make the characters look and move more realistically, Thomas and Johnston, at Walt's urging mind you, would go to places like the market to observe old women. I swear I'm not making this up. I would have paid anything to have seen one of those guys get caught staring at old women and then try to explain their way out of that one. The animators also used a mix of old and new techniques to make Sleeping Beauty come to life. Live-action references were again used to help give the animators direction in their animation of key scenes throughout the movie, using famous actors and actresses such as Helen Stanley, Ed Kemmer, Spring Byington, and Frances Bavier as models. In terms of innovations, Sleeping Beauty saw one of the earliest experiments with xerography, with Wolfgang Reitherman xeroxing the dragon in the final battle in order to easily change her size depending on what the shot called for. But the biggest technological advancement of the feature was making it the first ever animated feature film to be filmed in Technorama 70mm film. Alright, I'm about to get into some heavy technical jargon here, but I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible, so just bear with me. So for a long time, most films, Disney included, were shot on 35mm film, with the 35 referring to the width of the cell, essentially making it a square. But with the growing television market, cinema started to use widescreen as a bit of a gimmick to get people to keep coming into the theaters. Now in the 1950s, there were three main versions of widescreen. There was Cinerama, which essentially used three cameras shooting 35mm film onto one wide screen. There was CinemaScope, which you may remember from the Lady and the Tramp review, which involved a camera shooting 35mm film, but with a special lens that would stretch it out onto a wide screen. And then there was Technorama, which used 70mm film, double the length of a normal frame, and was shot through the camera horizontally as opposed to vertically. Shooting the film in Technorama meant a lot more work for the animators, who had to make the backgrounds bigger and more detailed in order to fill the screen. In the end, it took an estimated 300 animators around 1 million drawings to complete Sleeping Beauty. But animation wasn't the only major task in the production of Sleeping Beauty, as sound was just as important. Opera singer Mary Costa was brought in to be the voice of Princess Aurora, and Disney standbys Eleanor Audley, Verna Felton, and Barbara Luddy were brought back to voice Maleficent, Flora, and Merryweather respectively. The music of Sleeping Beauty also went through its fair share of changes. In the beginning, Walt wanted an original score for the film, but upon hearing and seeing the international popularity of the Sleeping Beauty ballet, written by famed composer Peter Tchaikovsky, decided on instead basing the film score off of the ballet, tasking George Bruns with adapting Tchaikovsky's work. Remember how I said we were going to bring back Perrault? Well, here it goes. So Tchaikovsky's ballet was based specifically off of Perrault's version of the tale, as was Briar Rose by the Brothers Grimm. So, even though Disney used the Brothers Grimm and Tchaikovsky's version of the tale as inspiration for their own movie, technically it's still inspired by Charles Perrault. It's like fairy tale Inception or something. The music was recorded in stereophonic sound, and although many songs were written for the film based on the music from the ballet, oftentimes the lyrics didn't make it to the final version, and instead just the music scored the action. As the end of production neared, Disney used many ways to help promote the upcoming film. The film was featured on Walt's television show, a board game based on the movie was released, and they even changed the name of the castle being built in Disneyland from Snow White's castle to Sleeping Beauty's castle, complete with animated dioramas of the plot in anticipation of the film. Finally, after 6 years and $6 million in production, Sleeping Beauty was released on January 29, 1959.
It's only in my dreams. But they say if you dream a thing more than once, it's sure to come true. And I've seen him so many times.
So Sleeping Beauty was intended to be Walt's biggest production to date, but how did it turn out? Well, let's point out the obvious first. Walt wanted this film to look different from his others, and they definitely accomplished that. It really does look unlike anything we've seen to this point, though I think it sort of depends on your taste whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. The main difference that I noticed was that the colors seemed almost flushed or muted, which is a huge contrast to the more vibrant looking films we've become accustomed to. Comparing it to a more cartoony movie like Dumbo is almost pointless, but even look at Cinderella compared to Sleeping Beauty. Not only is one a lot brighter than the other, but everything looks a lot sharper in Sleeping Beauty as well. For me personally, I prefer the more rounded and brighter animation, but honestly that's just personal preference. In regards to what the animators were trying to do, which was make this movie look different than any other princess tale to date, they definitely did that, so you do have to give them the credit there. And I say this all the time, but the animation is really superb again, particularly in the scenes where the fairies give Aurora their gifts. I was also very interested with how the music was handled in the film. Aside from Once Upon a Dream, which of course is a classic, there really aren't many songs in Sleeping Beauty, or at least where there is singing, it seems more integrated within the score than something that stands by itself. What ends up happening, I think, is that it strengthens the score as a whole, which is already pretty good in and of itself. What's interesting about this approach is that way back in 1937, Walt had said that he wanted songs to fit in the movie rather than depart from it, and this really seems like the epitome of that. Even in Once Upon a Dream, it never feels like the movie makes a hard left turn when a song comes up, and that's a pretty impressive feat. But where I think this movie really sets itself apart from the others is in its characters, though not for the reason you probably think. Our main character in the film, Aurora, is actually formally introduced to us far after when we're accustomed to meeting our main character. Usually we get to see the character, then meet some supporting players, and then get our plot and see how all these established personalities react to it. Here, we get the supporting players first, then the plot, and then Aurora. But the strategy makes sense when you consider that Aurora, of course, falls under a spell midway through the movie. And in all actuality, Aurora is barely even in the film, having only 18 minutes of screen time, the lowest of any Disney character whose name is in the title of the film. Which begs the question, is Aurora really our main character? I mean, we don't get to see much of her throughout the film, and admittedly, her character really doesn't change all that much throughout the movie either, which makes sense when you consider how few lines she has. Honestly, I'd make a case that Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather are much more involved as main characters than Aurora is. Which brings me to the real strength of this film, the supporting cast. As I mentioned before, I thought that Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather were very interesting characters. They're funny, they're sincere, and they even end up fighting when they need to. We actually had a prince with a real personality for the first time in a Disney movie. And they finally gave him a name! It only took 22 years, but finally our knight in shining armor can be called something more than just Prince Charming. And of course our villain is about as good as they get with Maleficent. I like that they actually gave her a fairly pretty complexion and instead allowed her personality and actions to truly show off how evil she was. I honestly think that, aside from her crazy green skin, the fact that she doesn't look like the prototypical ugly Disney villain is what makes her so memorably evil. Sleeping Beauty had a tall task of being unique from other, similar Disney films, and I definitely think that this was accomplished. Really, my only complaint with the film was that it wasn't longer, which is something I rarely ever say. If the movie had an extra 20 or 30 minutes, I think it would have really helped with the pacing, which did get a little rushed at times. I mean, I know that Disney is notorious for having their characters fall in love at a breakneck pace, but I mean, come on. This has to be the quickest courtship of any Disney movie. I mean, they sing one song and then they're ready to get hitched, to the point where they don't even exchange names. Why is everybody so adverse to, "Hi, my name is blank" in Disney movies? It would solve a lot of problems. But overall, Sleeping Beauty is a strong effort across the board from Disney, and it definitely managed to stand on its own from other Disney films. Despite the work put into it, Sleeping Beauty struggled in its initial release. Critics were mixed on the film, with some criticizing the film's lack of character development, and the film that cost $6 million to make, nearly double the price of Disney's past animated features, only brought back $5.3 million in its initial release. Due to the high cost and low returns, Disney ended up having major layoffs at the studio. It would be the last Disney film ever to have hand-ink cells, and some felt that it would be the last feature-length animated fairy tale to ever be made. Yikes. So the movie that Disney thought was going to be the pinnacle of animation almost killed the genre of the animated fairy tale forever. Imagine a world without movies like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Frozen. The entire Disney company as we know it could have been altered. However, despite the box office issues, Sleeping Beauty still garnered an Academy Award nomination for Best Scoring in a Feature Film and a Grammy nomination for Best Soundtrack. Luckily, like nearly every Disney film from this time period, Sleeping Beauty would bounce back in later years. Although never re-released in Walt's lifetime, Sleeping Beauty would return to theaters 4 times, in 1970, 1979, 1986, and 1995, and currently has made a lifetime gross of $51.6 million, or $606.8 million when adjusted for inflation. The characters of Sleeping Beauty have been featured all over various media, both from Disney and otherwise. Aurora has been featured in wildlife prevention PSAs, the Fairies have shown up in shows like Sophia the First, and Maleficent not only has become the mascot for Disney's villains, but also was featured in a live-action reimagining of the tale entitled Maleficent, released in May of 2014. And all of the characters have appeared in video games and on the ABC TV show Once Upon a Time as well. And of course, Sleeping Beauty's presence is seen throughout the Disney parks as well, with the characters being featured in numerous shows, and Sleeping Beauty's castle remaining as one of the enduring and most recognizable symbols of Disneyland in California. So although Sleeping Beauty struggled at first due to its differences, there is no denying that it is one of Disney's all-time classics. Well guys, that wraps it up for me this week. Hope you all enjoyed, and let me know what your thoughts on Sleeping Beauty are below. Also make sure to subscribe to my channel, and it's a little outdated, but if you're still in the Christmas mood, make sure you check out last week's video. Also make sure to check out next week's video, and if you like this video and want to see more reviews like it, be sure to check out the Disney Guy Review playlist. And I'll see you all next week.